Hey guys, tonight we're not stepping into the mind of a philosopher. We're stepping onto the Earth before the human race had called it their home. And spoiler alert, it looked nothing like the movies. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The silent Earth before anything breathed. There was a time when Earth had no sound. Not silence the way you understand it. Not the quiet of a closed door or a snowy night. But a deeper absence. No wind moving through leaves, because there were no leaves. No water lapping against a shore, because there was no shore that stayed still long enough to be lapped against. No breath, no heartbeat. No pulse of any kind anywhere on the entire surface of the planet. For hundreds of millions of years, Earth was a world with no ears to hear it and nothing worth hearing. It is strange to think about now, sitting somewhere warm, breathing without effort, surrounded by a world so thoroughly alive that emptiness feels almost impossible to imagine. But long before there was a first heartbeat, before there was a first breath, before there was anything that could be called alive in any sense we would recognize, Earth was something closer to a wound that had not yet healed. Let us go back. Not carefully, not gently. There is no gentle way to approach the beginning of a planet, but honestly, the way it actually happened. A world made of fire. Roughly 4.5 billion years ago, our solar system was a spinning disk of dust and gas circling a newly ignited sun. Gravity did what gravity does. It pulled matter toward matter, small clumps becoming larger clumps becoming boulders, boulders becoming something you might, with some generosity, call a planet. Earth did not arrive fully formed. It assembled itself out of collision after collision after collision, 100 million years of cosmic violence compressed into rock. Picture it, if you can bear to. The infant Earth was not blue. It was not green. It had no oceans, no continents, no sky in any sense we would recognize. It was a globe of molten rock, its surface glowing an angry orange-red, seas of liquid stone shifting beneath a black, ash-choked atmosphere. There was no day and no night in the way we understand those words, because there was no clear sky to mark the difference. There was only heat and pressure and the slow, grinding violence of a planet still deciding what it wanted to become. And then, into this furnace, something enormous arrived. Most planetary scientists now believe that sometime in Earth's first 100 million years, a Mars-sized world, sometimes given the name Theia, collided with our planet in a glancing, catastrophic impact. The collision would have been almost impossible to comprehend in scale. It liquefied portions of both worlds. It threw a vast plume of vaporized rock into orbit around the wounded Earth, material that would, over time, gather itself together and cool into the moon that still hangs above us every night. Think about that the next time you look up at a clear evening sky. The moon is not a separate story. It is a scar. It is a piece of Earth's own violent childhood, flung outward and left to circle its parent world forever, a permanent reminder of the collision that helped shape the planet you are standing on right now. For tens of millions of years after that impact, Earth remained essentially uninhabitable by any definition we would accept. The surface was an ocean of magma. Heavier elements, iron, nickel, sank toward the center under their own weight, forming the dense metallic core that today generates the magnetic field protecting all of us from deadly solar radiation. Lighter materials rose toward the surface, cooling, eventually, into the first thin, unstable crust the planet had ever worn. The slow work of cooling. Cooling a planet is not fast work. It took Earth tens of millions of years just to develop a crust solid enough to be called a surface. And even then, that surface would have looked nothing like solid ground. It would have looked like the crust on a pot of something boiling too violently to ever fully cool. A thin, dark skin repeatedly cracked open by the molten material still churning beneath it. Volcanic fissures venting gas and fire across the entire globe at once. Because there was no life yet. No reason for anything to hold back. The air itself, if you could call it air, was nothing you would want to breathe. It carried almost no oxygen. Instead, it was a thick, choking mixture of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, methane, and sulfur compounds vented endlessly upward from volcanic eruptions that never seemed to stop. There was no ozone layer. There was no shield of any kind between the planet's surface and the raw, unfiltered radiation of a young, aggressive sun. Ultraviolet light poured down onto the Earth with a force that would kill nearly anything alive today within minutes. And yet, somewhere in this violence, water began to matter. Where Earth's water originally came from is still debated by scientists. Some of it likely arrived embedded in the rocky material that built the planet in the first place, and some of it may have been delivered later by comets and water-rich asteroids colliding with the young Earth during a period of heavy bombardment. However it arrived, once the planet's surface had cooled enough, water that had been locked as vapor in the thick atmosphere began, at last, to fall. Try to picture it. Rain falling on a world that had never known rain before. Not a shower, not a storm, but a downpour that may have lasted, in some form, for thousands of years without real interruption, as the atmosphere slowly wrung itself out onto a cooling stone surface. Steam rising in white sheets wherever the falling water met still hot rock. Rivers of condensation carving the first channels the world had ever known. Channels with no plants to hold their banks. No fish to swim their currents. Nothing at all except mineral-rich water finding the low places in a world still trembling with its own formation. Slowly, patiently, without witness, the first oceans of Earth began to gather. An ocean with no one in it. By around 4 billion years ago, Earth likely had oceans, vast, warm, mineral-rich, covering much of the planet's surface. But these were oceans with no life in them at all. No fish, no coral, no plankton drifting in green clouds near the surface. Just water, moving under an alien sky, lit by a sun roughly 30% dimmer than the one we know today. Its light passing through an atmosphere still thick with volcanic haze. The continents, such as they were, would have been unrecognizable, small, dark, jagged islands of volcanic rock breaking the surface of a planet-spanning sea, constantly reshaped by tectonic movement and relentless volcanic activity. There was no soil in the way we understand it, because soil requires the slow work of biology, of roots and decay and microorganisms breaking down rock over unthinkable stretches of time. There was only stone, sharp, raw, freshly cooled stone, offering no comfort to anything, because there was nothing yet that needed comfort. This was the Hadean Aeon, named, fittingly, after the underworld. It is one of the strangest ironies of Earth's history that the period named for hell was also the period in which the ingredients for life were quietly, invisibly, assembling themselves in the dark. The chemistry of almost. Here is where the story becomes genuinely mysterious, because even now, with all our science, we do not know exactly how the leap happened. The leap from chemistry to biology, from a planet with interesting molecules to a planet with something that could be called, however loosely, alive. What we do know is this: the ocean floor of early Earth was not calm. It was riddled with hydrothermal vents, cracks in the crust where mineral-rich, superheated water surged up from below, carrying with it a rich cocktail of dissolved chemicals. Around these vents, in the total darkness of the deep ocean, chemical reactions occurred constantly, driven not by sunlight, but by heat and mineral chemistry alone. Many scientists now believe it was in and around these vents, or in shallow tidal pools exposed to cycles of wetting and drying, depending on which hypothesis you favor, that the first self-replicating molecules began to form. Not living cells. Not anything you would recognize under a microscope as an organism. Just molecules capable of an extraordinary, almost unbelievable trick, making copies of themselves. This is, when you sit with it, one of the strangest transitions in the entire history of the universe. For billions of years, matter in the cosmos followed physics and nothing more, atoms combining, energy dispersing, structures forming and collapsing according to indifferent natural law. And then, on this one small, wet, volcanic planet, chemistry crossed a threshold no one designed and no one witnessed. Molecules began to make more of themselves. Once that happened, once replication with occasional error became possible, evolution itself, in its most basic form, had already begun, long before anything alive in the way we would define it existed at all. The first cells. By around 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago, geological evidence suggests that something had crossed the line from complex chemistry into biology. The oldest widely accepted evidence of life comes in the form of stromatolites, layered mineral structures built up over long stretches of time by colonies of microorganisms, primarily early bacteria, living in shallow water and trapping sediment in thin, repeating layers. These early organisms were nothing like the animals or plants that would eventually fill the planet. They were single-celled, microscopic, without a nucleus, without any of the complex internal architecture that defines the cells in your own body today. But they were undeniably alive. They metabolized. They reproduced. They responded, in their limited chemical way, to their environment. And crucially, they left descendants, an unbroken chain of biological inheritance that, if you trace it forward far enough, eventually reaches every living thing on Earth today, including you. Some of these earliest organisms were anaerobic, meaning they lived without oxygen, drawing energy instead from chemical reactions involving sulfur, iron, or other compounds abundant in the young Earth's oceans and atmosphere. This detail matters more than it might seem, because oxygen, the gas your lungs depend on every second of every day, was, for these earliest inhabitants of Earth, not just unnecessary. It was, in high enough concentrations, a poison. The world before oxygen. This inverts almost everything we assume about what makes a planet livable. For roughly the first 2 billion years of life's existence on Earth, oxygen was not the friendly, life-sustaining gas we associate with a healthy planet. It was scarce, and to many of the organisms alive at the time, it was dangerous, a reactive, corrosive substance capable of damaging delicate biological molecules. The early atmosphere was dominated instead by nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. Life adapted to this world, not around it. Organisms evolved entire metabolic systems built around chemistry we would now consider exotic or even toxic. And for an extraordinarily long time, this was simply how Earth worked. Single-celled organisms, invisible to the naked eye, silently living, reproducing, and slowly diversifying in oceans that would have looked, to any observer, essentially unchanged for hundreds of millions of years at a stretch. This is one of the most humbling facts in the entire story of life on Earth. For well over half of the planet's entire history, nothing more complex than a single cell existed anywhere. No eyes, no limbs, no nervous systems, no movement in any way we would recognize as purposeful. Just an almost unimaginable expanse of deep time, filled with microscopic life, slowly changing the chemistry of an entire planet without any of it happening fast enough for anything to notice. Because there was nothing yet capable of noticing anything at all. The slow poison that saved everything. And then, gradually, something striking began. Certain microorganisms, the ancestors of what we now call cyanobacteria, developed a new biochemical trick, photosynthesis. Using sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, these organisms began producing energy in a new way, and in doing so, they released a byproduct into the surrounding water and, eventually, the atmosphere. That byproduct was oxygen. At first, the effect was barely noticeable on a planetary scale. Oceans absorbed much of the oxygen being produced, reacting with dissolved iron to form vast deposits of iron oxide on the seafloor. Deposits we still mine today, layered red and gray rock formations known as banded iron formations, silent geological records of a slow chemical revolution happening one microorganism at a time. But over hundreds of millions of years, the oxygen kept coming. Eventually, the oceans could not absorb it fast enough, and oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere itself. This event, which unfolded roughly 2.4 to 2.0 billion years ago, is now known to scientists as the Great Oxidation Event, and it may be the single most catastrophic environmental disaster in the entire history of life on Earth. For the vast majority of organisms alive at the time, organisms whose entire biochemistry had evolved in a world without free oxygen, this new, reactive gas was lethal. Entire lineages of anaerobic microorganisms were pushed to the brink of extinction or forced into the few remaining oxygen-free environments left on the planet. Deep mud, sealed sediment, isolated pockets where the old chemistry could still survive. It is a strange thing to consider. The very gas that allows you to be alive right now, reading these words, breathing without a single conscious thought, was once a slow-moving poison that devastated most of the life that existed on Earth. Every breath you take is, in a very real sense, a legacy of that ancient catastrophe, a catastrophe that cleared the way, over unthinkable stretches of time, for everything that would eventually be able to breathe. Setting the stage. By the time this chapter of Earth's story draws to a close, the planet had already accomplished something extraordinary, entirely without witnesses. It had cooled from a molten wound into a stable, water-covered world. It had produced, from raw chemistry alone, the first replicating molecules and, eventually, the first true cells. It had survived, or rather, its life had survived, a self-inflicted atmospheric catastrophe that permanently altered the chemistry of the entire planet. And still, after all of that, after literally billions of years of change, Earth remained a world of microorganisms. No visible animals, no plants, no fungi, nothing that could be seen without instruments no one on Earth would develop for billions more years. If you had somehow stood on the shore of an early Earth ocean 2 billion years ago, you would have seen water, rock, sky, and nothing else. No sound but wind and waves. No movement but tides and volcanic tremors. A world utterly, completely alone, in the deepest sense of that word. Alive, in the most technical definition, and yet as quiet and still, to any casual observer, as a world with no life in it at all. But the stage was set. The chemistry had been solved. The atmosphere had been transformed. And somewhere in the depths of that ancient, alien ocean, cells were beginning, slowly, to do something new, to cooperate, to specialize, to combine into structures more complex than anything that had come before. The long silence of Earth's earliest life was, unknowingly, drawing toward its end. Something was coming. It would take still more time than the human mind can comfortably hold, but it was coming. And when it finally arrived, it would not arrive quietly. The sea before the storm. For nearly 3 billion years, life on Earth kept a secret so well hidden that, for most of that time, it consisted of nothing more than single cells drifting through ancient seas, rewriting the chemistry of an entire planet while leaving almost no visible trace behind. And then, in a period of time so short by geological standards that scientists still argue over exactly how sudden it truly was, everything changed. This is the story of the moment life stopped being simple. The long wait. Scientists really do call it the Cambrian explosion, one of the more dramatic names in all of paleontology, and, for once, an accurate one. But before we get to the explosion itself, it helps to understand just how strange and slow the build-up to it really was. By roughly 2.1 billion years ago, cells more complex than the earliest bacteria had begun to appear. Eukaryotic cells, containing a nucleus and other internal structures, more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. This was a major evolutionary leap, but it still produced nothing that looked remotely like an animal. For over 1 billion years after this innovation, life remained almost completely microscopic and, for the most part, entirely single-celled. Then, sometime around 1.5 to 1 billion years ago, something else happened. Some of these eukaryotic cells began sticking together. Not in the loose, incidental way that microorganisms sometimes clump, but in genuinely cooperative arrangements. Colonies of cells that began, ever so slightly, to specialize, some cells taking on different roles than others within the same organism. This was the first hesitant step toward multicellular life, and it would take hundreds of millions of years more before that step turned into anything resembling a body. By around 635 to 541 million years ago, in the period geologists call the Ediacaran, Earth's oceans finally began to host something that looked, at least loosely, like early animal life. These were the Ediacaran biota, strange, soft-bodied organisms, many of them shaped like fronds, discs, or quilted mats, spread across the ancient seafloor. Some scientists debate whether many of these organisms were even true animals in the modern sense, or something closer to a totally separate, ultimately unsuccessful evolutionary experiment. Whatever they were, the Ediacaran organisms shared a common trait. They were, for the most part, gentle, passive. Many appear to have lacked mouths, guts, or any obvious means of active predation. Reconstructions suggest a world of soft, stationary, filter-feeding life forms, anchored to a quiet seafloor, absorbing nutrients from the water around them, with no eyes to see and no reason yet to run. It would not last. Something sharpens. Around 541 million years ago, the fossil record undergoes one of the most dramatic transformations in the entire history of life. Within a geological window of perhaps 20 to 25 million years, astonishingly brief on a planetary timescale, the ocean fills, almost without warning, with an unusual diversity of complex animal life. Nearly every major group of animals alive today, including the ancestors of everything from insects to fish to, eventually, us, appears to trace its origin to this single, explosive period, the Cambrian explosion. Scientists still debate exactly why this happened so quickly. Some point to a sharp rise in atmospheric and oceanic oxygen levels, finally reaching concentrations high enough to support the energy demands of larger, more active animals. Others point to genetic innovations, the evolution of new families of genes controlling body plan development, allowing, for the first time, complex and varied physical structures to be built from a shared genetic toolkit. Still others point to an evolutionary arms race that, once triggered, simply could not stop accelerating. That last idea may be the most important one, because the Cambrian explosion isn't just a jump in the number of species. It's the arrival of something the world had genuinely never dealt with before. Predation. The first hunters. Before the Cambrian, life in the ocean had, for the most part, existed in a strange kind of truce. Organisms absorbed nutrients from the water or filtered organic particles from the seafloor, but there was little in the way of active, deliberate hunting, one organism chasing down, capturing, and consuming another. The Ediacaran world, whatever else it may have been, was largely a peaceful one. The Cambrian shattered that peace permanently. Fossil beds from this period, most famously the Burgess Shale in what is now Canada, and the slightly older Chungjiang deposits in China, preserve an astonishing snapshot of early animal life in almost unbelievable detail, including soft tissue that almost never survives the fossilization process. What they reveal is a world suddenly filled with creatures built for one of two purposes: catching something or avoiding being caught. Trilobites, among the most iconic Cambrian animals, scuttled across the seafloor in armored exoskeletons, some of the very first animals to develop true, image-forming eyes, a sensory innovation that would have utterly transformed the rules of survival in the ocean overnight. For the first time, an animal could see a predator coming from a distance, or spot potential prey moving through the water. Vision, once it arrived, changed everything, because an arms race between eyes and the animals trying to avoid them had now, irreversibly, begun. Then there was Anomalocaris, a name that translates, roughly, to abnormal shrimp, though there was nothing small or unassuming about it. Anomalocaris could grow to well over a meter in length, making it, by the standards of its time, an absolute giant, likely the apex predator of its era. It swam using a series of flexible side lobes running the length of its body, and at its front end, it bore two large, jointed grasping appendages, used to seize prey and drag it toward a strange, circular mouth lined with plates, built to crush and shred whatever it managed to catch. Imagine being a small, armored trilobite, drifting along the Cambrian seafloor, when the water around you suddenly darkens with the shadow of something enormous, undulating, and utterly new to the world. A creature your entire evolutionary lineage has no inherited instinct to fear, because nothing like it has ever existed before. This was the reality of the Cambrian Ocean, an environment being rewritten, generation by generation, by the sudden, brutal logic of eat or be eaten. An explosion of body plans. What makes the Cambrian genuinely strange isn't just that predators showed up. It's the sheer, almost reckless variety of body forms that appeared alongside them, most of which never made it past this one narrow window of time. A few became the ancestors of body plans still around today, in modified form. Most simply didn't work out, and evolution moved on. Consider hallucigenia, a creature so strange that for decades after its discovery, paleontologists could not even agree which end was the head and which was the tail. It moved on rows of thin, spiked legs, its body lined with additional pairs of sharp spines along its back, likely serving as defense against predators. Its very name, inspired by the word hallucination, reflects just how alien it appeared to the scientists who first attempted to reconstruct it. Consider Opabinia, an animal with 5 eyes mounted on stalks and a long, flexible, hose-like appendage extending from its head, ending in a claw-like structure used to grasp food and bring it toward its mouth. No animal alive today looks remotely like Opabinia. It represents, as far as we know, an entire evolutionary experiment that ultimately led nowhere, a body plan tried once by evolution and then, quietly, abandoned. And consider Pikaia, small, unassuming, easy to overlook among the more dramatic Cambrian animals. A slender, eel-like creature only a few centimeters long, swimming through the water, using simple muscular undulations along a flexible internal rod running the length of its body. That rod, called a notochord, represents one of the earliest known examples of a structure that would eventually evolve, over hundreds of millions of years, into the vertebral column, the backbone. Pikaia, in other words, may represent one of the earliest known ancestors of every vertebrate animal that would ever live, including every fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal to come, including, eventually, every human being who has ever existed. Sit with that for a second. The ancestor of your own spine may have been a small, forgettable creature, easily overshadowed by the far more dramatic predators sharing its ocean, simply trying, day after day, not to be eaten. Why the explosion mattered. Call the Cambrian explosion what it actually is. The moment the basic architecture of the modern animal kingdom got locked in. Arthropods, mollusks, chordates, nearly every major group of animals alive today either shows up for the first time in this window, or has its clearest early roots here. Before the Cambrian, evolution had spent billions of years perfecting the basic chemistry and cellular biology of life. After the Cambrian, evolution shifted its focus towards something new: shape, structure, sensory capability, and behavior. The invention of hard shells, armored plating, jointed limbs, compound eyes, and active hunting behavior did not just create new species. It created an entirely new category of evolutionary pressure, one that would continue shaping life on Earth for the rest of its history, all the way up to this very moment. By the close of the Cambrian period, roughly 485 million years ago, Earth's oceans had been utterly transformed. What had been, for billions of years, a relatively quiet, microbial world had become something alive with movement, competition, sensory awareness, and violence, a true ecosystem, in every modern sense of the word, filled with creatures actively pursuing, evading, hiding, and hunting. And yet, for all of this transformation, one thing had not yet changed. The land remained silent. No animal had yet crawled from the water onto dry ground and survived the attempt. No plant had yet turned bare stone into something resembling soil. The continents of early Earth remained as stark, as lifeless, and as untouched as they had been for billions of years before. Vast stretches of naked rock, baking under an unfiltered sun, waiting, without any awareness that they were waiting, for something to finally arrive. That arrival would take tens of millions of years more. But the ocean had already made its point, after nearly 3 billion years of buildup. Given enough time and enough pressure, life doesn't just survive. It transforms, it diversifies, and it reaches, blindly, with no plan at all, toward every shape it can find, including plenty that nobody, least of all the animals themselves, could have predicted. The next chapter of this story would be written not by creatures perfecting life in the water, but by creatures foolish or desperate, or lucky enough to attempt something the ocean had never allowed before, leaving it fully. When giants ruled the water, there is a particular kind of desperation required to leave the only world you have ever known. For the first vertebrate animals crawling toward the edge of the ocean roughly 375 million years ago, that desperation was not philosophical. It was not curiosity, and it was not ambition. It was, in all likelihood, the simple, brutal pressure of survival in an increasingly crowded and dangerous sea, a pressure so intense that dry land, hostile and untested as it was, began to look, to some very strange fish, like an opportunity worth the risk. This is the story of how life left the water. But before it could leave, it first had to conquer the water completely. The Age of Fish. In the tens of millions of years following the Cambrian explosion, vertebrate life underwent its own quiet, steady revolution. The earliest fish-like creatures of the Cambrian and Ordovician periods were small, jawless, and largely defenseless. Simple filter feeders or scavengers, protected, if at all, by bony external plating rather than any active means of fighting back. For a long stretch of early vertebrate history, fish were not predators. They were prey. That began to change dramatically during the period known as the Devonian, stretching from roughly 419 to 359 million years ago, a period so thoroughly dominated by fish, in both diversity and evolutionary innovation, that it has earned the informal title the Age of Fishes. The single most important innovation of this era was almost absurdly simple in concept, yet it changed the entire trajectory of vertebrate evolution: the jaw. Early jawless fish had been limited to filtering, sucking, or scraping at food, entirely unable to bite, tear, or seize prey with any real force. The evolution of hinged, muscular jaws, likely derived from modified gill support structures, gave certain fish, for the first time, the ability to actively grip and crush. It is difficult to overstate how significant this innovation was. Nearly every dominant predator in vertebrate history since, every shark, every dinosaur, every mammal, every human being reading or listening to these words with a jaw of their own, descends from this single ancient breakthrough. Among the first great beneficiaries of this innovation were the placoderms, an early group of armored, jawed fish. The most famous among them, Dunkleosteus, deserves a moment of proper attention because it represents one of the most genuinely terrifying predators the ocean has ever produced. Dunkleosteus. Dunkleosteus could grow to lengths of up to 9 meters, its massive head and thorax encased in thick, heavy bony armor plating, its rear body more lightly built and flexible, likely allowing for fast, powerful bursts of movement through the water. It had no true teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, its jaws were lined with sharp, self-sharpening bony plates capable of exerting bite forces rivaling or exceeding those of the largest predators alive on Earth today, sufficient to shear straight through the armored shells of other fish, or, according to some fossil evidence, even through the bodies of other Dunkleosteus. Imagine, for a moment, standing, impossibly, safely, at the edge of a Devonian sea, watching the water below. There is no warning system for what approaches. No fin breaking the surface. No shadow crossing overhead in time to react. There is only the water itself. And then, suddenly, a shape the length of a city bus, armored like a tank, closing the distance with terrifying speed, jaws capable of shearing through solid bone in a single bite. For any smaller fish sharing that ocean, Dunkleosteus wasn't really a predator in the usual sense. It was closer to a natural disaster that happened to want something. Yet even Dunkleosteus, dominant as it was, represented only one branch of an incredibly diverse and rapidly evolving fish population. Sharks, too, were flourishing during this period, having diverged from other jawed fish lineages and begun developing the cartilaginous, hydrodynamic body plan that remains remarkably effective and largely unchanged, even in shark species alive today, hundreds of millions of years later. And somewhere among all of this diversity, largely overlooked, unremarkable, and far from dominant, a very different kind of fish was silently evolving traits that would, eventually, change the entire history of life on land. The fish with almost legs. Deep within certain freshwater and coastal environments of the Devonian period, a group of fish known as lobe-finned fish, Sarcopterygians, in scientific terminology, possessed an anatomical feature that set them apart from most of their contemporaries. Rather than the thin, ray-supported fins typical of most fish, lobe-finned fish had thick, muscular, fleshy fins, supported internally by bones arranged in a pattern strikingly similar to the basic structure of a limb. For most of their history, these fins served the same basic purpose fins always serve: propulsion and steering through water. But in certain shallow, oxygen-poor, plant-choked freshwater environments, swamps, tidal pools, sluggish river deltas, these sturdy, muscular fins may have offered an unexpected advantage. They could be used to push against solid ground, to shift a fish's body weight in ways a typical fin simply could not manage, perhaps to move between separated pools of water during dry periods, or to navigate through dense underwater vegetation more effectively than a conventional fin allowed. This is not a story of an animal deciding to grow legs in order to walk on land. Evolution does not work by intention. It works by accident, by mutation, by whatever incremental advantage happens to improve survival and reproduction in a given moment, regardless of what future purpose that advantage might eventually serve. The muscular, bone-supported fins of lobe-finned fish were not evolved for walking. They were evolved for surviving in cluttered, shallow, unpredictable freshwater environments. It was only later, much later, that this pre-existing anatomical structure turned out to be extraordinarily well-suited for a different purpose no ancient fish could have anticipated. Chicxulub. In 2004, paleontologists working in the Canadian Arctic uncovered fossils of a creature that represents, more clearly than almost any other single fossil discovery, the transitional link between fish and the earliest four-limbed land animals. They named it Chicxulub, an Inuktitut word chosen deliberately to honor the region where it was found. Chicxulub, which lived roughly 375 million years ago, is often described, quite fairly, as a fish with the beginnings of a neck. Unlike most fish, whose heads are fused directly to their shoulder region, Chicxulub had a flexible neck joint, allowing it to move its head independently, an adaptation likely useful for an animal navigating shallow, cluttered environments where visibility and mobility mattered more than pure streamlined swimming speed. More striking still, Chicxulub possessed the early stages of true limb bones within its fins, recognizable, in simplified form, as versions of the humerus, radius, and ulna that would later define the forelimb structure of every subsequent land vertebrate, including, again, your own arm. Its fins likely allowed it to prop itself up in shallow water or on muddy, semi-submerged ground, perhaps to breathe air directly using primitive lung-like structures, or to ambush prey along the water's edge in ways a fully aquatic fish simply could not manage. Chicxulub was not yet a land animal. It almost certainly spent the overwhelming majority of its life in water, but it represents, with extraordinary clarity, a body caught mid-transition, an animal whose anatomy was beginning, gradually, accidentally, to prepare itself for a world its ancestors had never touched. The first true steps. Within a few million years of animals like Chicxulub, true tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, begin appearing in the fossil record. Early tetrapods such as Ichthyostega and Acanthostega retained many fish-like features. They still had gills alongside primitive lungs. They still possessed fin-like tail structures useful for swimming, and their limbs, while more developed than Chicxulub's, were likely not yet strong or flexible enough to support extended movement across dry land. Acanthostega, strikingly, appears to have had limbs with too many digits by later standards. Some fossils show as many as 8 toes per foot, a reminder that the now standard 5-digit limb structure found across nearly all land vertebrates today, including your own hands, was not an inevitable outcome, but simply one of several early evolutionary experiments that happened to persist. These earliest tetrapods likely spent most of their lives still in the water, using their developing limbs primarily to navigate dense, shallow, plant-choked swamp environments rather than to walk freely across open, dry ground. True, confident terrestrial locomotion, the ability to spend extended periods entirely out of water, would take additional millions of years of further adaptation. But the direction had, unmistakably, been set. Why leave the water at all? So why leave the water at all? Water, in many ways, remains an easier environment for animal life than land. It offers buoyancy, reducing the structural demands placed on a body by gravity. It offers a stable, moisture-rich environment that never risks the kind of dehydration land animals must constantly guard against. Why would evolution favor any movement away from an environment so comparatively forgiving? The most likely explanation lies not in the appeal of land itself, but in the pressures of water. The Devonian oceans and freshwater systems, as we have already seen, were becoming increasingly crowded with capable, aggressive predators, armored placoderms, early sharks, and other rapidly diversifying jawed fish. In shallow, oxygen-poor swamp environments, competition for food and safe territory would have been intense. For certain lobe-finned fish already adapted to these cluttered, semi-aquatic habitats, the ability to briefly exploit territory at the water's edge, territory almost completely free of predators and competitors, precisely because nothing else could survive there yet, may have offered a genuine, if temporary, advantage. Land, in the Devonian period, was not attractive because it was comfortable. It was attractive, in an entirely unconscious, evolutionary sense, because it was empty. The world waiting on the shore. And what, exactly, was waiting on that empty shore? By the time the earliest tetrapods began tentatively exploring the water's edge, land was no longer the barren, lifeless expanse it had been for most of Earth's history. Plants had already begun their own quiet colonization of dry ground, and with them, in their shadow, small early arthropods, ancestors of modern insects, spiders, and millipedes, had already established themselves as the first true land animals, feeding on early plant material and each other in ecosystems still almost totally invisible and easily overlooked. For the first vertebrate animals to fully commit to life on land, this pre-existing world of plants and small arthropods represented both an opportunity and a challenge, an unclaimed food source, but also an unfamiliar, physically demanding environment utterly unlike anything their ancestors had ever navigated. Breathing air directly, rather than filtering oxygen from water through gills, required significant respiratory adaptation. Supporting body weight without the buoyancy of water required significant skeletal and muscular adaptation. Preventing dehydration in open air required changes to skin structure entirely unnecessary for a fully aquatic animal. None of these adaptations arrived instantly, and none arrived because any individual animal needed them to arrive. They accumulated generation after generation through the same blind, patient, undirected process that had shaped every other transition in the history of life. Small variations, small advantages, small increases in the likelihood of surviving long enough to reproduce, repeated across spans of time, too vast for any single lifetime to meaningfully register. By the close of the Devonian period, roughly 359 million years ago, true tetrapods had firmly established themselves, not yet dominant, not yet numerous, but present, and improving with each successive generation. The conquest of land by vertebrate life had begun, and it would not be undone. Behind them, in the water, the age of the great armored fish was already beginning to fade, giving way to newer, more modern fish lineages that continue, in evolved form, to dominate Earth's oceans even today. But ahead of the earliest tetrapods lay a fully new world, dry, harsh, unfiltered by water, and almost completely unclaimed. It would not stay unclaimed for long, because behind these first hesitant land vertebrates, an entirely different, alien form of life was already transforming the very air above the empty stone continents, quietly, patiently, turning a barren world green for the very first time in Earth's long and mostly silent history. The green invasion. Before there was a single leaf anywhere on Earth, the continents were among the most hostile environments the planet had ever produced, not because of heat or cold or any dramatic natural disaster, but because of something far simpler and far more absolute: total exposure. No shade, no shelter, no soil capable of holding moisture. Just raw, sun-blasted stones stretching to every horizon, bombarded constantly by ultraviolet radiation with nothing in the atmosphere, yet capable of meaningfully filtering it. This is the story of how that emptiness ended, not with animals, not at first, but with something far quieter and, in its own way, far more transformative. The first green things. Long before true plants existed, Earth's land surfaces were not entirely without biological activity. As early as 1.2 billion years ago, and almost certainly by around 470 million years ago, thin films of photosynthetic microorganisms, cyanobacteria, and, later, early algae, had likely begun colonizing damp rock surfaces and shallow freshwater margins, forming primitive biological crusts wherever sufficient moisture allowed. These early colonizers were not plants in any technical sense, and they would have been essentially invisible to any casual observer, appearing, at most, as a faint greenish or blackish tint across otherwise bare stone. The true evolutionary breakthrough came with the emergence of land plants proper, descendants of green algae that had, over time, developed increasingly sophisticated adaptations for surviving outside of water completely. The earliest true land plants, appearing in the fossil record by around 470 million years ago, would have borne little resemblance to any plant familiar today. They were small, low-growing, moss-like organisms, lacking true roots, true leaves, or any significant internal support structure. They had no way to transport water efficiently through their bodies, which limited them to remaining constantly, physically close to a moisture source, damp soil, shallow pools, saturated ground near rivers and coastlines. For these earliest plants, survival on land required solving two enormous, interconnected problems: how to draw water up from the ground without the surrounding buoyancy and moisture of an aquatic environment, and how to stand upright against the pull of gravity without water's supportive resistance to lean on. Both problems would take tens of millions of years to solve. The invention of wood. The solution arrived, gradually, in the form of a remarkable biological innovation: vascular tissue. Certain early plant lineages developed specialized internal structures, tubes reinforced with a rigid compound called lignin, capable of transporting water and nutrients from roots to upper portions of the plant, while simultaneously providing structural rigidity strong enough to allow the plant to grow upward, away from the ground, toward greater access to sunlight. This single innovation, the vascular system, and the lignin-reinforced tissue that would eventually become wood, changed the entire trajectory of terrestrial life. Plants no longer needed to remain low and sprawling, tethered closely to damp ground. They could now grow upward, competing with neighboring plants for access to sunlight in an entirely new kind of biological competition. Not predator versus prey, but simply height versus height. One plant lineage after another evolving to grow taller than its neighbors in an endless, silent race toward the sky. By the Devonian period, the same era in which the earliest tetrapods were beginning their tentative exploration of dry land, plant life had already begun this dramatic vertical expansion. True roots had evolved, anchoring plants firmly into increasingly stable soil while drawing water and minerals from deeper underground than ever before. True leaves had evolved, dramatically increasing the surface area available for photosynthesis. And by the later Devonian, the first true trees had appeared. The first forests, Archaeopteris, one of the earliest known tree-like plants, could grow to heights of over 30 meters, with a substantial woody trunk, extensive root systems, and fern-like fronds spreading outward to capture sunlight. Forests of Archaeopteris, appearing roughly 385 to 359 million years ago, represent the very first true forests in the history of planet Earth. Vast stretches of towering, woody vegetation covering regions that had, for the entirety of Earth's prior history, been nothing but bare, exposed stone. This was a bigger deal than it might sound. Forests don't just sit inside an environment. They rebuild it from the ground up, literally. Root systems grind solid rock down into fine mineral particles, and that process is where true soil comes from, a substance that, before plants, hadn't really existed on Earth in any meaningful amount. Add in centuries of fallen leaves, branches, and entire dead trees decomposing on the forest floor, and you get soil rich enough, eventually, to support far more complex plant and animal life than bare rock ever could. Just as significantly, the sheer scale of new photosynthetic activity across these expanding forests began pulling enormous quantities of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, while releasing correspondingly enormous quantities of oxygen. Atmospheric oxygen levels, which had already been rising steadily since the ancient cyanobacteria of the Great Oxidation Event billions of years earlier, began climbing to levels genuinely unprecedented in Earth's entire prior history. Levels that would, by the following geological period, produce some of the strangest and most spectacular animal life the planet has ever hosted. The insects arrive. Even before true forests fully established themselves, small arthropods had already begun colonizing land, almost certainly following closely behind the earliest plant colonizers, feeding on plant material, decaying organic matter, and, eventually, each other. Fossil evidence suggests that early arachnids, myriapods, the ancestors of modern millipedes and centipedes, and eventually true insects had established themselves on land by the middle of the Devonian period, if not earlier, making arthropods, in a very real sense, among the very first true animal colonizers of dry land. Arriving well before vertebrates like Chicxulub and its early tetrapod relatives had even begun their own tentative journey onto shore. But it was the following period, the Carboniferous, stretching from roughly 359 to 299 million years ago, that would see arthropod life on land reach a scale of size and diversity never seen before or since. The Age of Giant Insects. The Carboniferous period takes its name from the vast deposits of carbon-rich coal formed during this era. Coal that represents, quite literally, the fossilized remains of the immense forests that dominated the period's landscape. Forests so extensive and so effective at capturing atmospheric carbon that the resulting drop in global carbon dioxide levels, combined with the corresponding rise in atmospheric oxygen, produced environmental conditions genuinely unlike anything Earth has experienced since. Atmospheric oxygen levels during the height of the Carboniferous are estimated to have reached as high as 35%, compared to roughly 21% in Earth's atmosphere today. This dramatic increase in available oxygen had a direct and striking effect on the arthropod life of the period, because insects and their relatives breathe in a fundamentally different way than vertebrate animals, not through lungs, but through a network of small tubes called tracheae, which passively diffuse oxygen directly into surrounding tissue. This respiratory system places a natural physical limit on how large an arthropod can grow, because larger bodies require proportionally more oxygen than passive tracheal diffusion can typically supply. With atmospheric oxygen levels dramatically elevated during the Carboniferous, that natural size limit expanded considerably, and arthropod life responded accordingly, producing some of the largest terrestrial invertebrates in the entire history of the planet. Meganeura. Among the most famous of these giant arthropods was Meganeura, an early relative of modern dragonflies, with a wingspan reaching up to roughly 65 to 70 centimeters, larger than many modern birds of prey. Imagine standing in a dense, humid Carboniferous forest, thick with towering ferns and primitive conifers, the air itself carrying a noticeably richer concentration of oxygen than anything breathable today, when the shadow of something with the wingspan of a hawk suddenly sweeps overhead, not a bird, because birds would not evolve for hundreds of millions of years yet, but an insect, gliding on wings nearly 3 feet across, hunting other arthropods through the dense forest canopy with the same predatory precision modern dragonflies display in miniature today. Alongside Meganeura, the Carboniferous forest hosted a striking range of other oversized arthropods. Arthropleura, a massive, plant-eating millipede relative capable of growing over 2 meters in length, making it among the largest land invertebrates ever known to exist. Enormous cockroach-like insects, some reaching sizes far beyond any cockroach alive today, and giant scorpions and spiders, thriving in the humid, oxygen-rich undergrowth of the world's first true forest ecosystems. A world still waiting for vertebrates. While arthropods reached genuinely spectacular sizes during the Carboniferous, vertebrate life on land, though established, remained comparatively modest and still deeply tied to water. Early amphibians, descendants of the first tetrapods that had emerged during the Devonian, diversified considerably during this period, but most remained dependent on water for reproduction, laying soft, unprotected eggs that would quickly desiccate and die if exposed to dry air for any significant length of time. This dependency effectively tethered early amphibian life to the margins of rivers, swamps, and lakes, preventing any meaningful expansion into Earth's vast, drier interior regions. The solution to this problem, a solution that would ultimately allow vertebrate life to fully and permanently break free from its ancestral dependence on water, arrived toward the very end of the Carboniferous period, in the form of another quiet, almost unremarkable biological innovation, the amniotic egg. This new type of egg, protected by a tough, semi-permeable shell and containing specialized internal membranes capable of retaining moisture and managing gas exchange, allowed certain vertebrate lineages, for the first time in the history of life, to reproduce totally independently of standing water. This single innovation would open the door to an entirely new and increasingly dry world, a world that early reptiles and the strange, tusked, sail-backed ancestors of mammals soon to follow them were now, for the very first time, fully equipped to conquer. The forest's long shadow. By the close of the Carboniferous period, roughly 299 million years ago, Earth had been utterly transformed from the barren, sun-blasted stone landscape of its earlier history. Vast forests now stretched across much of the planet's land surface. Soil, once fully absent from Earth, now existed in thick, stable, richly organic layers, supporting an increasingly complex web of plant, fungal, and animal life. The atmosphere itself, once dominated by carbon dioxide and almost entirely devoid of oxygen, now carried levels of breathable oxygen higher than at almost any other point in Earth's entire history. None of this was inevitable. Worth remembering next time you're standing under a canopy of trees, breathing without any effort at all. The soil beneath your feet exists because ancient plants, over hundreds of millions of years, patiently broke down solid rock into something capable of sustaining further life. The oxygen in your lungs exists, in significant part, because of forests that vanished into coal seams hundreds of millions of years before a single mammal, let alone a single human being, ever walked the Earth. The Carboniferous forest would not last forever. Climate shifts toward the end of the period, and continuing into the following Permian period, would gradually dry and cool significant portions of the planet, fragmenting and ultimately reducing the vast coal forests that had defined the era. But the transformation they had already achieved, a green, oxygen-rich, soil-covered world, fully capable of supporting complex terrestrial ecosystems, was permanent. And into this newly transformed world, freed at last from any dependency on standing water by the invention of the amniotic egg, a new empire of vertebrate life was about to rise, an empire that would, for tens of millions of years, rule over a world unlike anything before it, long before the first true dinosaur ever took a single step. The age before the dinosaurs. There is a strange and persistent misconception, buried deep in popular imagination, that dinosaurs represent the beginning of large, dominant reptilian life on Earth. As though before Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops, there was simply nothing worth mentioning. This could not be further from the truth. Tens of millions of years before the first true dinosaur ever existed, Earth already had its own reptilian empire, an empire of sailback predators, tusked plant eaters, and strange, distant ancestors of mammals, ruling over supercontinents in a world entirely their own. And that empire would end not gradually, not gracefully, but in what remains, to this day, the single most catastrophic extinction event in the entire recorded history of life on Earth. One continent, one world. By the beginning of the Permian period, roughly 299 million years ago, Earth's continents had drifted together into a single, enormous landmass known to modern geologists as Pangaea, a supercontinent stretching from pole to pole, surrounded by a single vast global ocean called Panthalassa. This unprecedented arrangement of Earth's land masses profoundly shaped the climate and ecology of the entire Permian world, creating extreme environmental gradients, lush, humid regions near the equator and along certain coastlines, and vast, increasingly arid desert interiors stretching across the supercontinent's enormous, ocean-isolated core. It was into this newly formed, climatically extreme world that the amniotic egg, that quiet carboniferous innovation freeing reptiles from dependency on standing water, finally allowed vertebrate life to fully expand. And expand it did, diversifying rapidly into two major evolutionary branches that would come to dominate Permian land ecosystems: the sauropsids, ancestors of modern reptiles and eventually birds, and the synapsids, a separate lineage that would eventually give rise to mammals. It is the synapsids, often, somewhat inaccurately, referred to in popular writing as mammal-like reptiles, that dominated the terrestrial ecosystems of the Permian world most dramatically, and it is here that our story of pre-dinosaur giants truly begins. Dimetrodon. If you have ever seen an image of a large, sail-backed, lizard-like predator and assumed it was a dinosaur, you were very likely looking at Dimetrodon, and you would have been mistaken in an understandable, extremely common way. Dimetrodon was not a dinosaur. It was not even a reptile in the strict modern sense. It was a synapsid, more closely related, in the deep evolutionary sense, to mammals, including you, than to any dinosaur that would not evolve for tens of millions of years after Dimetrodon had already gone extinct. Dimetrodon lived during the early Permian period, roughly 295 to 272 million years ago, and it represented one of the dominant apex predators of its time. It could grow up to nearly 4 meters in length, its body supported by powerful limbs and armed with a jaw lined with differentiated teeth, a genuinely significant evolutionary innovation, since most earlier vertebrates had uniform, simple teeth throughout their jaws. Dimetrodon's teeth varied in size and shape depending on their position, some suited for piercing, others for slicing, an early step toward the kind of specialized dental structures that would later become common across many predatory vertebrate lineages, including, eventually, mammals. Most striking of all was Dimetrodon's dramatic dorsal sail, an enormous, skin-covered structure of elongated spines rising from its back, in some individuals reaching heights comparable to the animal's own body. Scientists have proposed several possible functions for this sail. Thermoregulation, allowing Dimetrodon to absorb or dissipate heat more efficiently than similarly sized animals without such a structure. Visual display, potentially used to attract mates or intimidate rivals and predators, or some combination of these and other functions still debated today. Whatever its precise purpose, the sail made Dimetrodon one of the most visually distinctive and instantly recognizable predators of the entire pre-dinosaur world. The rise of more advanced synapsids. As the Permian period progressed, synapsid evolution continued advancing well beyond animals like Dimetrodon, producing increasingly sophisticated and, in certain respects, increasingly mammal-like forms. Therapsids, a more advanced group of synapsids that emerged during the Middle Permian, developed a range of anatomical features that brought them noticeably closer to true mammalian biology. More efficient, upright limb postures allowing for faster and more energy-efficient movement compared to the sprawling gait of earlier reptiles and synapsids. Increasingly specialized and differentiated teeth, supporting more varied and efficient feeding strategies, and, in certain lineages, possible early evidence of increased metabolic activity, potentially hinting at the beginnings of warm-bloodedness, though this remains an area of ongoing scientific research and debate. Among the most successful therapsid groups were the Gorgonopsians, formidable predators equipped with prominent saber-like canine teeth, filling ecological roles broadly comparable to large predatory mammals today, despite existing tens of millions of years before any true mammal would appear. Alongside them, herbivorous therapsids such as the Dicynodonts flourished in remarkable numbers and diversity, characterized by a distinctive combination of a toothless, likely keratin-covered beak and a pair of prominent tusks, used for digging, foraging, or defense. Dicynodonts, in fact, represent one of the most successful and widespread groups of large terrestrial herbivores in the entire history of pre-dinosaur life, with fossil evidence found across nearly every region of the former Pangaean supercontinent. By the late Permian period, therapsids had become the dominant large land animals across much of Earth's single unified continent, an empire of tusked herbivores and saber-toothed predators, occupying nearly every major ecological role that dinosaurs would later fill, tens of millions of years before any dinosaur had ever existed. It must have seemed, to whatever passive, unthinking sense an ecosystem might possess, as though this arrangement could continue indefinitely. It could not. The Great Dying. Approximately 252 million years ago, at the boundary between the Permian and the following Triassic period, Earth experienced what remains, according to virtually all available scientific evidence, the single most severe extinction event in the entire 3.5 billion year history of life on this planet. It has come to be known, with grim and completely appropriate simplicity, as the Great Dying. The scale of this catastrophe is difficult to fully comprehend. Current scientific estimates suggest that somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species and roughly 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species were driven to extinction during this single event. It represents, by a significant margin, a more severe extinction than even the far more famous asteroid impact that would end the age of dinosaurs roughly 186 million years later. If the asteroid impact that later ended the Cretaceous period represented a devastating single blow, the Great Dying represented something closer to the near-total collapse of the entire biosphere. The primary cause of this catastrophe is now widely understood to have been an almost unimaginably massive series of volcanic eruptions in a region of what is now Siberia, producing a geological feature known today as the Siberian Traps. Over a period estimated at anywhere from several 100,000 to roughly 2 million years, these eruptions released enormous volumes of lava, covering an area of Siberia comparable in size to the modern continental United States, in some places to a depth of hundreds or even thousands of meters. The eruptions themselves would have been devastating on a purely local and regional scale. But their true planetary catastrophe came from what they released into the atmosphere alongside the lava. Staggering quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide, released over a geologically brief but still extraordinarily prolonged period of intense volcanic activity. A planet poisoning itself. The environmental consequences of this volcanic activity unfolded across multiple interconnected, mutually reinforcing catastrophes, compounding one another over a period that, while brief by geological standards, would have felt, to any organism capable of perceiving it, like a slow, inescapable, multi-generational collapse of the entire living world. Massive carbon dioxide emissions drove severe, rapid global warming, with some estimates suggesting average global temperatures rose by as much as 8 to 10 degrees Celsius during the peak of the extinction event, a change vastly more extreme and more rapid than anything modern climate models project, even under worst-case future scenarios. This warming would have rendered large portions of the planet's equatorial regions essentially uninhabitable for most complex life, while simultaneously disrupting weather patterns, ocean currents, and precipitation cycles across the entire globe. Simultaneously, massive sulfur dioxide emissions likely triggered severe acid rain across large portions of the planet, degrading soil quality, damaging or destroying plant life across vast regions, and further destabilizing already fragile terrestrial ecosystems already struggling under extreme heat stress. In the oceans, the consequences were, if anything, even more severe. Rising global temperatures reduced the ocean's capacity to hold dissolved oxygen, while increased volcanic carbon dioxide, absorbed into seawater, drove significant ocean acidification, severely impairing the ability of marine organisms to build and maintain shells and skeletons composed of calcium carbonate. The combined effect was the development of vast oceanic dead zones, regions of water so depleted of oxygen and so chemically hostile that they could no longer support meaningful marine life at all, spreading across enormous stretches of what had, until recently, been thriving, productive ocean ecosystem. The combined, compounding effect of extreme heat, ocean acidification, oceanic dead zones, and widespread terrestrial ecosystem collapse proved catastrophic beyond almost anything else in Earth's entire biological history. Entire evolutionary lineages that had thrived for tens of millions of years, including the Gorgonopsians, those saber-toothed apex predators that had once ruled Permian ecosystems with what must have seemed, from any internal ecological perspective, like unshakable dominance, vanished entirely, forever, within a geological instant. What survived? And yet, catastrophic as it was, the Great Dying did not end life on Earth. A small fraction of species, resilient, adaptable, in some cases simply fortunate in the particular ecological niches they happened to occupy, survived the extinction event, and, in the tens of millions of years that followed, gradually rebuilt the shattered ecosystems of a nearly empty planet. Among the survivors were small, hardy therapsids, including early ancestors of the lineage that would, over an almost incomprehensibly long stretch of subsequent evolutionary time, eventually give rise to true mammals. Among the survivors, too, were small, unremarkable reptiles belonging to a lineage that had, until this point, played only a minor role in Permian ecosystems, overshadowed almost totally by the dominant therapsids around them. That lineage was the archosaurs. In the aftermath of the Great Dying, with the dominant Permian therapsid predators largely eliminated and entire ecological niches suddenly, catastrophically empty. This previously minor reptilian lineage found itself with an extraordinary, entirely unearned opportunity, a nearly blank ecological slate, on a slowly recovering planet, with almost no established competition remaining to stand in its way. It would take millions of years of further evolution, adaptation, and, eventually, another significant extinction event before this lineage would produce the animals we now know with such enduring fascination as the dinosaurs. But the foundation for that future empire, an empire built not out of inevitable destiny, but out of sheer evolutionary opportunity, carved from the wreckage of the worst catastrophe life on Earth had ever endured, had already, quietly, been laid. The world that had once belonged to sailback Dimetrodon and tusked Dicynodonts was gone. What would rise in its place would be stranger, in some ways smaller at first, and would take its time, but it was coming. And it would eventually grow into something the world had never seen before. The rise of the terrible lizards. Empires rarely announce themselves at their beginning. They tend to start small, overlooked, unremarkable, easily dismissed by anything paying closer attention to more established rivals. This was precisely the case for the small, quick-moving reptiles that would, tens of millions of years later, be given a name meaning terrible lizard. At the very start of their story, there was nothing especially terrible about them at all. A world slowly recovering. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, roughly 252 million years ago, Earth's ecosystems entered a period of prolonged, difficult recovery. The environmental damage inflicted by the Siberian Traps eruptions had been so severe, and had so thoroughly disrupted established food webs on both land and in the ocean, that scientific evidence suggests it may have taken as long as 10 million years for biodiversity to begin meaningfully rebounding toward pre-extinction levels, an extraordinarily long recovery period, even by the patient standards of geological time. The early Triassic world that emerged from this recovery period was, in many respects, a strange and simplified one. With so many established Permian lineages eliminated, ecosystems were often dominated by a comparatively small number of highly successful, opportunistic survivor species. Among the most notable of these early Triassic survivors was Lystrosaurus, a stocky, pig-sized dicynodont therapsid that, remarkably, appears to have thrived in the immediate aftermath of the extinction event to an unusual degree, at times making up a significant majority of all known terrestrial vertebrate fossils from the earliest Triassic period across widely separated regions of the former Pangaean supercontinent. Yet even as therapsid survivors like Lystrosaurus initially dominated the recovering Triassic landscape, a fully different lineage was silently beginning its own rise, largely unnoticed, in the shadow of these more established survivors. The Archosaur radiation. The Archosaurs, the reptilian lineage that had played only a relatively minor role in pre-extinction Permian ecosystems, began diversifying rapidly during the early and middle Triassic period, ultimately splitting into two major evolutionary branches that would each go on to shape the future of life on Earth in profound and very different ways. One branch, the Pseudosuchians, would eventually give rise to modern crocodilians, along with a wide and notably diverse range of Triassic-era relatives, some of which grew to substantial size and occupied dominant predatory roles throughout much of the Triassic period, including, in certain cases, large, powerfully built, land-dwelling crocodile relatives that, for a significant portion of the Triassic, actually rivaled or exceeded early dinosaurs in both size and ecological dominance. The other branch, the Avemetatarsalia, would eventually give rise to two of the most significant animal lineages in the entire history of life on Earth. The pterosaurs, the first vertebrate animals ever to achieve true, powered flight, and the dinosaurs, the first true dinosaurs. The earliest confirmed true dinosaurs appear in the fossil record around 243 to 233 million years ago, during the Middle to Late Triassic period. Far from the massive, dominant giants that would define the group's later reputation, these earliest dinosaurs were, almost without exception, small, lightly built, fast-moving bipedal animals, generally no larger than a modern dog or, at most, a small horse. Among the earliest and most significant of these pioneering dinosaurs was Eoraptor, discovered in what is now Argentina, dating to roughly 231 million years ago. Eoraptor measured only around 1 meter in length, weighing perhaps 10 kilograms, a genuinely modest size for an animal that belonged to a lineage that would, tens of millions of years later, produce some of the largest land animals in Earth's entire history. Eoraptor possessed a mix of features suggesting an omnivorous diet, with some teeth suited for gripping prey and others more suited for processing plant material, hinting at the considerable dietary flexibility that likely helped early dinosaurs establish themselves within already crowded, competitive Triassic ecosystems. Alongside Eoraptor, another early dinosaur, Herrerasaurus, also from the same region and roughly the same time period, represented a somewhat larger and more clearly carnivorous early dinosaur, reaching lengths of up to 6 meters in the largest known individuals, already showing early evolutionary steps toward the specialized predatory adaptations that would come to define many later, far more famous carnivorous dinosaur lineages. It is important to understand, clearly and without exaggeration, that these earliest dinosaurs were not yet dominant animals within their ecosystems. Throughout much of the Triassic period, dinosaurs remained a relatively minor component of terrestrial faunas, generally overshadowed in both size and ecological prominence by the larger, more established Pseudosuchianarchosaurs, those early crocodile relatives, as well as by surviving large therapsids and other Triassic reptile groups that had already established themselves more firmly within existing ecological niches. For tens of millions of years, in other words, dinosaurs were simply one moderately successful group among many, coexisting alongside, and in many cases overshadowed by, a wide range of other Triassic reptiles that, at the time, appeared to hold every advantage in the ongoing competition for ecological dominance. This would not last. The world that made room. Toward the very end of the Triassic period, approximately 201 million years ago, Earth experienced another significant, though considerably less catastrophic, extinction event, now known to scientists as the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event. While less severe than the Great Dying that had ended the Permian period, this extinction event was nonetheless significant enough to fundamentally reshape the balance of terrestrial ecosystems. The precise cause of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction remains a subject of ongoing scientific research, though the leading hypothesis points toward another episode of massive volcanic activity, this time associated with the breakup of the Pangaean supercontinent, which was, by this point in Earth's history, beginning its long, slow process of fragmentation into the separate continents recognizable today. This volcanic activity, associated with a geological feature known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over a relatively short geological time frame, driving significant global climate disruption broadly similar in character, though considerably smaller in overall scale, to the catastrophe that had ended the Permian period roughly 50 million years earlier. The ecological consequences of this extinction event proved dramatically uneven across different reptile lineages. Many of the large Pseudosuchianarchosaurs, those dominant crocodile relatives that had, throughout much of the Triassic, overshadowed and outcompete early dinosaurs, were severely affected, with many major lineages disappearing entirely or being reduced to a small number of surviving forms. Dinosaurs, by contrast, appear to have weathered the extinction considerably more successfully, for reasons that remain somewhat debated among paleontologists but may relate to factors including their generally smaller body size, faster growth rates, more efficient respiratory systems potentially better suited to fluctuating atmospheric conditions, and greater overall ecological flexibility compared to some of their more specialized rivals. Whatever the precise combination of factors involved, the outcome was unmistakable and, in retrospect, historically transformative. With many of their primary ecological competitors severely diminished or eliminated, dinosaurs emerged from the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event with an extraordinary, largely unearned opportunity. Much as the Archosaur lineage as a whole had once benefited from the aftermath of the Great Dying 50 million years earlier, an empire begins. In the years and millions of years that followed the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, Dinosaurs began a rapid and remarkably thorough expansion into ecological roles across the planet that had previously been dominated by other reptile groups. Freed from much of their prior competition, dinosaur lineages began diversifying dramatically in both size and form, giving rise, over the following tens of millions of years, to the enormous, spectacular range of dinosaur species that would come to define the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods that remain, in popular imagination, virtually synonymous with the very concept of prehistoric life itself. The path that led here is stranger than it first appears. Dinosaurs did not become the dominant land animals of their era through some sense of evolutionary inevitability or predetermined destiny. They began as a small, unremarkable branch of an already minor archosaur lineage, one among many groups of reptiles competing within the difficult, slowly recovering ecosystems that emerged after the worst extinction event in the entire history of life on Earth. For tens of millions of years, they remained secondary players, overshadowed by larger, more established competitors that, at the time, must have appeared to hold every conceivable advantage. And then, twice. First through the initial opportunity created by the Great Dying, and again through the further opportunity created by the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the dinosaurs happened to survive catastrophes that eliminated many of their most significant rivals, leaving behind ecological space that dinosaurs, through some combination of biological advantage and simple fortunate timing, proved well suited to fill. It is a pattern worth remembering as this story continues, because it would repeat again in a far more dramatic and far more famous form, roughly 135 million years later. Though that time, it would not be the dinosaurs benefiting from catastrophe. It would be an entirely different lineage of small, unremarkable survivors, waiting quietly in the shadows of a dinosaur-dominated world, for their own turn at an empire they could not yet imagine. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, at the close of the Triassic period, the terrible lizards had only just begun to rise. Ahead of them lay tens of millions of years of increasingly spectacular evolutionary expansion, an age of true giants, taller than buildings, stranger and more magnificent than almost anything the world had produced before. The empire of the dinosaurs was only just beginning. The golden age of giants. Somewhere in what is now the American West, roughly 150 million years ago, a creature the length of 2 school buses lifted its head 30 feet into the air, stripped a mouthful of conifer needles from a branch no other animal on the continent could reach, and swallowed without chewing. It didn't need to chew. It had no cheek teeth built for grinding, no jaw muscles built for the job. It just ate, and kept eating, because a body that size runs on volume, not precision. This is the Jurassic, the period that gave the word dinosaur its popular meaning. And unlike the tentative, dog-sized survivors we left off with at the end of the Triassic, the animals in this chapter are, by any measure, enormous. How you build an animal the size of a building. The sauropods, long-necked, long-tailed, plant-eating dinosaurs, are the signature achievement of the Jurassic period, and they remain, even now, the largest land animals to have ever walked the Earth. Diplodocus stretched to roughly 25 meters from nose to tail tip. Brachiosaurus stood tall enough to look into a 4th-floor window. Some later sauropod relatives, found in South America, may have approached 35 meters in length and weighed as much as 70 tons. Getting an animal to that size on land is genuinely hard. Water helps support weight, which is part of why the largest animal alive today, the blue whale, lives in the ocean. Sauropods had no such help. They needed a different solution, and evolution found several at once. Their bones were riddled with air pockets, part of a respiratory system connected to a network of air sacs extending through much of the skeleton. The same basic system, in simplified form, that birds use today, and it likely descended from these dinosaurs directly. This kept sauropod skeletons far lighter than their size would suggest, while also allowing for a much more efficient flow of oxygen through the lungs than the in-and-out breathing cycle mammals rely on. A sauropod could pull more oxygen out of each breath than an elephant of comparable effort ever could. Their long necks, meanwhile, solved a foraging problem rather than a breathing one. A single Brachiosaurus could stand in one spot and strip leaves from a wide arc of forest canopy without taking a step, which mattered enormously for an animal that needed an almost unbroken stream of plant matter just to stay alive. Some sauropods may have eaten for 18 or more hours a day. There wasn't time for anything else. The predators built to match them. Prey that large demands, predators built for the job. Allosaurus, the dominant large carnivore of the Jurassic North American ecosystem, reached lengths of up to 9 or 10 meters, with a skull built less like a modern crocodile's crushing bite and more like a hatchet, thin-bladed, serrated teeth designed to slice rather than clamp, likely delivered in a strike-and-retreat style against prey too large to simply overpower in a single bite. Fossil evidence gives us more than guesswork here. A Stegosaurus tail spike has been found with a puncture wound matching the shape of an Allosaurus pubic bone, and an Allosaurus tail vertebra has been found with damage consistent with a Stegosaurus spike strike. Somewhere in the Jurassic American West, at least one of these fights actually happened, and we have the bones to prove it. Stegosaurus and the rise of armor. Speaking of Stegosaurus, this is the period where herbivores started arming themselves in earnest. The double row of bony plates running down its back remains one of the most argued about features in all of dinosaur paleontology. Display? Temperature regulation? Some combination of both, changing blood flow to either show off to a rival or cool down after a chase. The honest answer is that nobody is fully certain, and that uncertainty is worth saying out loud rather than papering over. What isn't in dispute is the tail, for long spikes, collectively nicknamed the thagomizer by paleontologists, a joke borrowed from a Far Side comic, which is a genuinely strange but true bit of trivia, swung with enough force to do real damage to an attacking Allosaurus. Life in the air. While sauropods claimed the ground, a completely separate group of reptiles had already claimed the sky. Pterosaurs, not dinosaurs themselves, but close cousins descended from the same archosaur lineage, had been flying since the late Triassic, and by the Jurassic they diversified into a wide range of forms, from crow-sized insect hunters to species with wingspans stretching several meters. And on the ground, in the leaf litter and undergrowth beneath the sauropod's feet, something much smaller and much easier to overlook was rewriting its own family's future. Small, feathered, meat-eating dinosaurs, theropods, the same broad group that includes Allosaurus and, eventually, Tyrannosaurus, had begun developing feathers, not for flight at first, but likely for insulation or display. Archaeopteryx, dating to roughly 150 million years ago and found in the fine-grained limestone of Bavaria, shows both reptilian teeth and a bony tail alongside true flight feathers arranged almost exactly like a modern bird's. It's one of the most quoted transitional fossils in the history of paleontology for a reason. It sits squarely on the line, and it doesn't let you pretend the line isn't there. Every bird alive today, the pigeon on your windowsill, the crow arguing with another crow outside your window, is, in the strict evolutionary sense, a dinosaur. Not descended from dinosaurs. A dinosaur. That's not a metaphor or a loose way of putting it. It's the literal conclusion of the evidence, and it tends to surprise people the first time they really sit with it. An ecosystem built on excess. What made the Jurassic world possible, more than any single adaptation, was climate. Warm, humid, largely ice-free, with high atmospheric carbon dioxide supporting lush plant growth across most of the planet's land surface. Conifers, ginkgos, cycads, and tree ferns formed dense forests capable of supporting the staggering caloric demands of sauropod herds. This was an ecosystem running on excess plant growth feeding excess herbivore size, feeding, in turn, predators that had to become correspondingly formidable just to make a living. It wouldn't last in this exact form. Continents kept drifting, climate kept shifting, and somewhere in the tens of millions of years ahead, an entirely new kind of plant was about to appear, one that would change not just what dinosaurs ate, but the shape of nearly the entire world they lived in. The last kings of the Cretaceous. If you had to pick one dinosaur to represent the entire idea of dinosaur in a single image, odds are good you'd land on Tyrannosaurus rex. Massive skull, a bite that could crack bone, tiny arms that have launched 1,000 jokes. It's the animal that ends this story, not because it was the most successful dinosaur ever, or the longest-lived lineage, but because it happened to be alive on the one particular afternoon, 66 million years ago, when the sky changed forever. We'll get to that afternoon in the next chapter. First, the world Tyrannosaurus actually lived in. A world turning green in a new way. The Cretaceous period, spanning roughly 145 to 66 million years ago, opened with forests still dominated by conifers and ferns, much like the Jurassic before it. But partway through the period, something genuinely new appeared: flowering plants. Angiosperms, to use the technical term, first show up clearly in the fossil record around 130 million years ago, and within a comparatively short span of tens of millions of years, they spread across the planet with startling speed, edging out older plant groups in many environments. This mattered far beyond aesthetics. Flowering plants grow faster, reproduce faster, and support far denser, more varied insect and small animal communities than conifer forests typically do. Their rise likely reshaped herbivorous dinosaur diets, and, over time, dinosaur jaw structures right along with it. Many of the plant-eating dinosaurs that dominate the Cretaceous fossil record, duck-billed hadrosaurs, horned ceratopsians, evolved increasingly sophisticated dental batteries, hundreds of interlocking teeth capable of grinding tough plant material far more efficiently than anything a Jurassic sauropod's simple peg-like teeth could manage. The ceratopsians. Triceratops is the one everybody knows, and for good reason. 3 horns, a massive bony frill, a body built like a rhinoceros scaled up to the size of a small truck. But Triceratops was only the last and largest in a long line of horned dinosaurs that diversified dramatically across the Cretaceous, especially in what is now North America and Asia. Styracosaurus carried a crown of long spikes radiating from its frill. Pachyrhinosaurus swapped horns for a thick, rough boss of bone across its snout. The frills likely served multiple purposes at once: display to attract mates, species recognition in mixed herds, and, in a fight, genuine defensive armor protecting the neck from a predator's bite. The duckbills. Less flashy than the horned dinosaurs, but arguably more successful in sheer numbers. The hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, became some of the most abundant large herbivores of the late Cretaceous. Many species, such as Parasaurolophus, carried elaborate hollow crests on their skulls, connected to the nasal passages in ways that likely allowed them to produce deep, resonant calls, something like a natural trombone built into the animal's own head. Fossilized trackways and bone beds containing dozens of individuals suggest many hadrosaur species lived and moved in large herds, possibly for protection against the predators sharing their world. Tyrannosaurus rex. Which brings us back to the tyrant lizard king itself. Tyrannosaurus rex lived during the very final few million years of the Cretaceous, roughly 68 to 66 million years ago, in what is now Western North America. Adults reached lengths of up to 12 or 13 meters and weighed somewhere in the range of 8 to 9 tons, though estimates vary. Its skull alone could exceed 1.5 meters in length, packed with thick, banana-sized teeth built not for slicing like Allosaurus's blade-like teeth, but for outright crushing. Bite force estimates for an adult Tyrannosaurus run as high as 8,000 to 12,000 pounds per square inch at the back teeth, among the strongest bites ever measured in a land animal, living or extinct. Those famously small arms remain genuinely puzzling. They were short, but not weak. The bones show attachment points for surprisingly robust muscle, and some researchers have proposed they were used to grip struggling prey pinned by the jaws, or to help push the animal up from a resting position. Nobody has settled the question definitively, and it's fine to say so rather than pretend otherwise. Growth rate studies, based on counting annual rings in fossilized bone much like tree rings, suggest young Tyrannosaurus went through a striking growth spurt during adolescence, potentially gaining over 700 kilograms a year during peak growth before leveling off in adulthood. A Tyrannosaurus, in other words, spent its adolescence putting on the equivalent of an adult human's weight roughly every month. Not the only kings. It's worth remembering that Tyrannosaurus, however famous, was a North American story. Other apex predators ruled other Cretaceous continents at the same time or in earlier phases of the period. Spinosaurus, found in North Africa and living somewhat earlier in the Cretaceous, may have been even longer than Tyrannosaurus, with a distinctive sail on its back, and, based on more recent fossil analysis, adaptations suggesting a partly aquatic lifestyle, hunting large fish in ancient river systems. Giganotosaurus, from South America, rivaled Tyrannosaurus in length, though it belonged to a totally separate branch of the theropod family tree. The Cretaceous world, in short, was not one kingdom. It was several, spread across continents that had, by this point, drifted apart enough to develop genuinely distinct dinosaur faunas, a level of regional diversity the earlier, more unified Pangaean world of the Triassic had never allowed. A world that didn't know it was ending. Here is the part that's genuinely hard to sit with. None of this, the herds of hadrosaurs, the horned ceratopsians defending their young, the young Tyrannosaurus putting on weight by the month, had any sense that it was living through the final act of a story that had been running for well over 150 million years. The Cretaceous world of 66 million years ago was not declining. Dinosaur diversity in the fossil record shows no clear, sustained collapse in the millions of years leading up to the end. Ecosystems were, by most measures, thriving, which makes what happened next even harder to process, because it wasn't a slow ending. It was an afternoon, the day the sky fell. Pick any ordinary spot on Earth, 66 million years ago, on a day like any other. A hadrosaur herd grazing near a river. A young Tyrannosaurus testing its bite on something too big to be worth the effort. Insects moving through fern undergrowth exactly as they had for tens of millions of years. Nothing about the morning suggested it would be the last one. The object. Roughly 66 million years ago, an asteroid estimated at 10 to 15 kilometers across, something on the order of the size of a small city, struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico at a site geologists call the Chicxulub crater. It was traveling somewhere around 20 kilometers per second, more than 60 times the speed of sound, when it hit. The scale of the impact is genuinely difficult to convert into anything the human mind processes comfortably. The energy released has been estimated at roughly 1 billion times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The impact excavated a crater roughly 150 kilometers across, and, in that first instant, vaporized rock across an area hundreds of kilometers wide, throwing an enormous plume of superheated debris up through the atmosphere, and, in some estimates, briefly outpassed it entirely into suborbital space. The first hour. Within minutes, that debris began falling back to Earth across the entire planet, not just near the impact site, but everywhere, as re-entering material heated the upper atmosphere to temperatures hot enough to trigger what researchers describe as a global infrared pulse. In regions closer to the impact, this pulse alone may have been enough to ignite wildfires across huge stretches of forest within hours. Further away, animals caught in the open would have experienced something closer to standing in front of an oven with the door suddenly opened, for long enough to cause severe burns or death, even at distances of thousands of kilometers. The impact also triggered earthquakes far beyond the scale of anything in recorded human history, along with tsunamis that swept across coastlines on multiple continents. Sediment deposits consistent with these tsunami waves have been found as far away as what is now the American Midwest, then still partly covered by a shallow inland sea. The long dark. If the first hours were about fire and shock waves, the following months and years were about something quieter and, in a way, more thorough. The impact struck a region of the Yucatan rich in sulfur-bearing rock, and the resulting vaporized sulfur, combined with soot from the global wildfires, was thrown high into the atmosphere in quantities sufficient to block a significant portion of incoming sunlight for months, possibly over a year, across the entire planet. With sunlight sharply reduced, photosynthesis largely stalled. Plants died first, at the base of nearly every food chain on Earth, both on land and in the ocean, where phytoplankton populations collapsed in a similarly abrupt way. Herbivores starved once the plants they depended on disappeared. Predators starved once the herbivores were gone. It was, in the most literal sense, a famine with no bottom to it. Each successive link in the food chain running out of options as the link beneath it failed. Global temperatures, after an initial pulse of heat from the impact itself, likely plunged sharply in the following months as sunlight was blocked, before rebounding into a different kind of long-term instability as greenhouse gases released by the impact and subsequent wildfires took over. Ocean chemistry shifted too, increased acidity, driven partly by the impact itself and partly by the fires that followed, placed severe additional stress on marine organisms already struggling with a collapsing food web. Who made it, and who didn't? By the time conditions began stabilizing, years later, an estimated 75% of all species on Earth had gone extinct. Every non-avian dinosaur, every Tyrannosaurus, every Triceratops, every hadrosaur herd was gone. Pterosaurs, having ruled the skies for well over 150 million years, vanished fully. In the oceans, ammonites, a group of shelled cephalopods that had survived and diversified since long before the dinosaurs even existed, disappeared for good. Survival, when it happened, doesn't appear to have followed any single clean rule, though several patterns recur across the fossil record. Smaller body size seems to have helped, since smaller animals generally need less food to survive a prolonged famine. The ability to burrow or shelter underground or underwater seems to have helped, offering some protection from the initial heat pulse and, later, some insulation from the worst of the temperature swings. A generalist diet, the ability to eat seeds, insects, carrion, or whatever happened to be available, rather than depending on one specific, vulnerable food source, appears to have mattered enormously. Which brings us to the birds, and to the small, unglamorous mammals that had spent the previous 150 million years living in the shadows of the dinosaur world, eating insects, staying small, staying quiet, and, without any way of knowing it, staying exactly the kind of animal that a catastrophe like this would eventually favor. An ending that was also a beginning. It would be easy to tell this chapter as pure tragedy, and in a real sense, it is one. An entire world's worth of dinosaurs, gone in a geological instant, after ruling the planet for longer than mammals have existed at all. But extinction events, brutal as they are, have a way of clearing space. We've already seen this pattern twice. After the Great Dying, the archosaurs found room to rise. After the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the dinosaurs found the room that let them become the giants of the Jurassic and Cretaceous. Now, for the third time in this story, a catastrophe was about to hand an empty world to whoever happened to be small, adaptable, and lucky enough to have survived it. This time, that world belonged to the mammals. The age of mammals begins. In the immediate aftermath of the Chicxulub impact, if you had somehow been able to walk across the surface of the Earth, you would not have found much to look at. Charred forests, empty rivers, a sky only slowly clearing after months of ash and debris. And moving through the wreckage, mostly at night, mostly alone, small, shrew-sized animals no larger than your hand, doing what their ancestors had done for the entire 150+ million years of the dinosaur age, staying out of sight. Who mammals already were. It's a common misconception that mammals only appeared after the dinosaurs died out. In fact, true mammals had existed since roughly 225 million years ago, evolving from the same cynodont therapsid lineage discussed back in the Permian and Triassic chapters of this story. For the entire span of the dinosaur age, well over 150 million years, mammals persisted as a quiet, mostly nocturnal, mostly small-sized story, rarely growing larger than a modern house cat, and usually much smaller than that. This wasn't necessarily a failure. It was, in a sense, a survival strategy that happened to pay off spectacularly in the end. Small body size, nocturnal habits, and generalist diets, insects, seeds, the occasional small animal, meant early mammals occupied an ecological niche the giant, resource-hungry dinosaurs mostly ignored. And when the asteroid hit, that same unremarkable niche turned out to be exactly the right place to be standing. An empty world, filled quickly. Mammal diversity exploded in the roughly 10 million years following the extinction event, in a pattern that will, by now, feel familiar. With dinosaurs gone and huge swaths of ecological space suddenly empty, large herbivore, apex predator, aerial hunter, and dozens of roles in between, mammal lineages began rapidly diversifying to fill them. Within just a few 100,000 years of the extinction, mammals had already begun growing significantly larger than anything in their lineage had managed during the entire preceding dinosaur age. By around 10 million years after the impact, some mammal species had reached the size of a modern bear or larger, a startling pace of size increase, given that these animals were descended from ancestors that had spent 150 million years staying deliberately small. Early Paleocene mammals included some strange, ultimately short-lived experiments. Pantodonts, a now extinct group of herbivorous mammals, included species like Barolambda, a slow-moving, bear-sized animal with a heavy tail, likely one of the largest land animals alive in the few million years immediately following the extinction. Other early groups filled predatory roles once occupied by small and mid-sized dinosaurs, though true apex predator mammals, genuinely large, dedicated carnivores, would take somewhat longer to fully develop. Terror birds and the return of the reptiles' cousins. Mammals were not, in fact, alone in exploiting the post-extinction world. In several regions, particularly South America, large flightless birds known as forest racids, popularly called terror birds, rose to become apex predators for millions of years, standing up to 3 meters tall with massive, hooked beaks capable of delivering powerful, axe-like strikes. For a significant stretch of the early age of mammals, the largest land predators on an entire continent weren't mammals at all. They were birds, direct descendants of the same dinosaur lineage that had supposedly gone extinct. Crocodilians, too, persisted largely unbothered through the extinction and the tens of millions of years that followed, a reminder that the age of dinosaurs ending is, in an important sense, a slightly misleading phrase. Birds are dinosaurs, and they never stopped being here. The rise of true giants. By the Eocene epoch, beginning around 56 million years ago, mammal evolution had produced genuinely large, specialized forms across multiple lineages. Early whales, descended from small, hooved, land-dwelling ancestors, had already begun their unusual return to the ocean, with transitional species like Ambulocetus, a crocodile-shaped, four-legged whale ancestor, showing the early stages of a transition that would eventually produce fully aquatic giants. Early horses, by contrast, remained small during this period, roughly the size of a modern dog, a reminder that evolutionary success doesn't always mean immediate size increase. Sometimes it means finding a stable niche and staying there for millions of years before conditions favor something larger. Primates, too, had already appeared by this point, small, tree-dwelling, large-eyed animals adapted for a nocturnal, insect-eating lifestyle in the dense forest canopies that covered much of the Eocene world. Nothing about them, at this stage, would have suggested to any observer that this particular lineage was worth paying special attention to. They were simply one more small mammal among many, filling one more available niche in a world still busy rearranging itself after catastrophe. 40 million years of rearranging. The following tens of millions of years, spanning the Oligocene and into the Miocene epoch, saw mammals continue diversifying and, in many lineages, growing progressively larger, as global climate gradually cooled and grasslands began expanding across continents previously dominated by dense forest. This shift toward open grassland environments favored entirely new adaptations, longer legs built for speed and endurance across open terrain, and, in herbivores, teeth increasingly specialized for grinding tough, gritty grasses rather than softer forest vegetation. By the close of this long stretch of mammalian expansion, nearly every major group of mammals alive today, carnivores, primates, rodents, hoofed herbivores, whales, bats, had already established its basic evolutionary lineage, even if many individual species we'd recognize today had not yet appeared. The world was cooling, grasslands were spreading, and somewhere in this long, patient process of diversification, the stage was being set for one of the strangest and coldest chapters mammalian life on Earth had ever faced. The ice was coming, and with it, some of the largest, strangest mammals to ever walk the planet. The rise of the ice giants. Picture a landscape of open, treeless grassland, what scientists call mammoth steppe, stretching across huge portions of the northern hemisphere. Much of modern Siberia, large parts of Europe, and a land bridge connecting Asia to North America across what is now the floor of the Bering Strait. Cold, dry, wind-scoured, and, against all expectation, remarkably productive, supporting some of the largest herds of large mammals the planet has ever hosted. This is the world of the Pleistocene Ice Age, spanning roughly 2.6 million to about 11,700 years ago, a period defined by repeated cycles of advancing and retreating glaciers, and by an extraordinary cast of oversized mammals collectively known as Ice Age megafauna. The mammoths. The woolly mammoth is the animal most people picture first, and for good reason. It's one of the best preserved prehistoric animals in existence, thanks to a number of strikingly intact frozen specimens recovered from Siberian permafrost, some still carrying preserved skin, hair, and even stomach contents. Woolly mammoths stood roughly 3 meters at the shoulder, covered in a dense double coat of long guard hairs over a soft undercoat, with a layer of fat up to 8 centimeters thick beneath the skin. Adaptations built for surviving temperatures that regularly dropped far below freezing across the mammoth steppe. Their curved tusks, in the largest individuals, could exceed 4 meters in length, likely used for a combination of foraging, sweeping snow aside to reach buried vegetation, and combat between rival males during the breeding season, based on patterns of tusk damage found in fossil specimens. Mammoths were not solitary. Genetic and behavioral evidence, along with comparison to their closest living relative, the Asian elephant, strongly suggests mammoths lived in matriarchal herds, with older females leading family groups and passing down knowledge of seasonal migration routes and reliable food and water sources across generations, a form of learned, transmitted knowledge not so different, in structure, from cultural knowledge in modern elephant herds today. The saber-toothed cat. Few Ice Age predators capture the imagination quite like Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, whose canine teeth could reach up to 28 centimeters in length, including the root. Those teeth were remarkably fragile compared to a modern lion's, thin and blade-like, better suited to a precise, deliberate killing bite than to struggling with actively fighting prey. This has led most researchers to conclude that Smilodon likely relied on overwhelming strength to pin large prey completely still before delivering a single, precise bite to the throat, rather than the prolonged wrestling matches typical of many modern big cats. Smilodon was also powerfully, almost stockily built compared to modern big cats, heavily muscled forelimbs, a relatively short tail, and a body plan built for explosive, close-range power rather than the sustained sprinting speed of an animal like a cheetah. It was an ambush predator, built for one devastating attempt rather than a long chase. Ground sloths, cave bears, and the rest of the cast. North and South America hosted their own spectacular Ice Age giants. Giant ground sloths, such as Megatherium, could stand up to 6 meters tall when reared up on their hind legs to browse high vegetation, weighing as much as a modern elephant despite belonging to a family of animals, sloths, whose modern representatives are famously small and slow. Glyptodon, a relative of modern armadillos, carried a solid, dome-shaped shell that could exceed 1.5 meters across, giving it, in silhouette, an unmistakable resemblance to a small car. In Europe and parts of Asia, cave bears, significantly larger than modern brown bears, denayed in cave systems across the continent in such numbers that their bones remain some of the most commonly found large mammal fossils in certain European cave sites even today. And across the mammoth steppe, woolly rhinoceroses grazed alongside mammoth herds, their long, forward-curving horns likely used, much like the tusks of mammoths, to clear snow from buried vegetation during the long Ice Age winters. A world shared, eventually, with someone new. For most of the Pleistocene, this world of ice giants existed without any human involvement at all. But toward the latter portion of the epoch, a new kind of predator began appearing across the mammoth steppe and its surrounding regions. One walking upright, on 2 legs, carrying tools, and, increasingly, carrying fire. We will get to exactly who these newcomers were, and where they came from, in the final chapter of this story. For now, it's enough to say that their arrival did not go unnoticed by the megafauna sharing their world. Beginning roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, depending on the region, most species of Ice Age megafauna went extinct in a wave that swept across nearly every continent except Africa, where megafauna had coexisted with human ancestors for far longer and had, correspondingly, more time to adapt. The causes of this megafaunal extinction remain genuinely debated among scientists. Climate change at the end of the last Ice Age, as glaciers retreated and the cold, productive mammoth steppe ecosystem broke apart into the more fragmented landscape we'd recognize today, certainly played a significant role. But the timing, in many regions, correlates closely with the arrival of human hunters and many researchers argue that a combination of climate stress and human hunting pressure, acting together, rather than either factor alone, best explains the pattern of extinctions across different continents and different timescales. The last of the giants. A handful of megafauna species held on longer than the rest. Woolly mammoths survived in isolated, small populations on Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia, until roughly 4,000 years ago, meaning mammoths were still alive on Earth after the Great Pyramid of Giza had already been standing for centuries. It's a genuinely strange fact to sit with. For a significant stretch of recorded human history, somewhere on the planet, mammoths were still walking around. But by the time those last isolated mammoth populations finally died out, the world they belonged to, the cold, sprawling, ice-shaped ecosystem of the Pleistocene megafauna, had already largely disappeared, replaced by a warmer, more fragmented world increasingly shaped not by climate or catastrophe, but by the deliberate choices of a single, newly dominant species. Which brings this story, at last, to its final chapter, and to the animal that had been walking quietly through nearly every scene of the last few million years, waiting, without any awareness of it, for its own turn. The last silence before us. Every story in this series so far has ended the same way. Something rises, dominates for a time that feels, from the inside, permanent, and then gives way, usually through catastrophe, to whatever comes next. Trilobites gave way to fish. Fish gave way to early tetrapods. Therapsids gave way to dinosaurs. Dinosaurs gave way to mammals. This final chapter is no different, except for one thing. This time, the whatever comes next is us. Africa, several million years ago. Around 6 to 7 million years ago, in the forests and woodlands of Africa, the evolutionary lineage that would eventually lead to modern humans split away from the lineage leading to modern chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives. Neither species at that split would have looked, to a casual observer, much like either of their eventual descendants. They were simply apes, living in African forests, doing what apes do. What set the earliest members of the human lineage apart, gradually, was not brain size, that would come dramatically later, but posture. By around 4.4 million years ago, a species known as Ardipithecus ramidus shows early evidence of a mixed lifestyle, capable of both walking upright on the ground and still climbing efficiently through trees, a transitional body plan that hadn't yet fully committed to life on the ground. That commitment came more clearly with Australopithecus, appearing by around 4 million years ago and persisting for well over 1 million years. The most famous individual fossil in this group, a partial skeleton nicknamed Lucy, and dated to roughly 3.2 million years ago, shows clear adaptations for habitual upright walking, a curved lower spine, a pelvis shaped for bipedal balance, leg bones angled inward toward the knee in a way that keeps the feet positioned beneath the body's center of gravity while walking. Lucy stood only about 1.1 meters tall, with a brain roughly the size of a modern chimpanzee's. Walking upright, it turns out, came long before big brains, not the other way around, which surprises people who assume intelligence must have driven the whole process from the start. Why walk at all? The advantages of upright walking are debated in the specifics, but broadly agreed upon in outline. Walking on 2 legs is significantly more energy efficient than the quadrupedal knuckle walking used by chimpanzees over long distances, which would have mattered considerably as African forests fragmented into more open, patchy woodland and savanna environments over this period, requiring more travel between separated food sources. Upright posture also frees the hands for carrying food, carrying infants, and, eventually, carrying and using tools, though tool use itself would develop gradually, over a further couple of million years, rather than arriving as a single sudden innovation. The genus Homo appears. By around 2.8 million years ago, fossil evidence points to the emergence of the genus Homo, the direct lineage that includes modern humans. Early species such as Homo habilis show a modest but genuine increase in brain size compared to earlier Australopithecines, alongside the earliest clearly associated evidence of deliberate stone tool manufacture, simple, sharp-edged flakes struck from larger stone cores, useful for cutting meat and processing plant material. Homo erectus, appearing by around 1.9 million years ago, represents a considerably more dramatic step forward. Homo erectus had a body plan strikingly similar in proportion to modern humans, was fully committed to upright walking and likely endurance running, controlled a significantly larger brain than earlier hominins, and, notably, was the first hominin species known to migrate out of Africa entirely, with fossil evidence found as far afield as Georgia, in the Caucasus region, China, and Indonesia. Homo erectus also appears to be associated with the controlled use of fire, based on evidence from multiple sites, a development that would have transformed nearly every aspect of hominin life, extending the usable day, providing protection from predators, and crucially, making a far wider range of foods digestible through cooking, which some researchers argue may have helped fuel the further brain growth seen in later hominin species, Neanderthals and other cousins. Beginning around 400,000 years ago, a distinct hominin lineage, Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, developed in Europe and Western Asia, adapted to the cold, often glacial conditions of the Pleistocene ice ages we covered in the previous chapter. Neanderthals were not the shuffling, unintelligent caricature of older popular imagination. They had brains roughly the same size as modern humans, sometimes larger, made sophisticated tools, controlled fire, buried their dead in ways that suggest some form of ritual or emotional significance. And, we now know from genetic evidence, interbred with the ancestors of modern non-African humans at least twice, leaving a small but measurable trace still present in the DNA of most people alive today. Neanderthals were not the only cousins we shared the world with. The Denisovans, known mostly from a small number of fossil fragments, and, more substantially, from DNA extracted from those fragments, represent another closely related hominin population living across parts of Asia during the same broad period, leaving their own measurable genetic trace in some modern populations, particularly in parts of Oceania. Us, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, first appear in the fossil record in Africa by around 300,000 years ago, based on fossils found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco, somewhat earlier than the roughly 200,000-year date long assumed to mark our species' origin. For a considerable stretch of time after that, tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens shared the planet with Neanderthals, Denisovans, and quite possibly other hominin populations not yet fully identified in the fossil record, including small-bodied species like Homo floresiensis, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores and nicknamed, somewhat informally, the Hobbit. By roughly 40,000 years ago, most of these other hominin populations had disappeared, leaving Homo sapiens as the sole surviving hominin species on the planet, the only time in the entire multi-million-year history of the human lineage that this has been true. For nearly the entire span of hominin evolution up to that point, multiple related species had coexisted, sometimes competing, sometimes interbreeding, sharing a planet that had, until quite recently in geological terms, always had room for more than one kind of human. The last silence, which brings this entire story to its final, quiet moment. Somewhere in Africa, more than 300,000 years ago, a small band of early Homo sapiens moved across a landscape that had already been walked by trilobites turned to stone, by the bones of Dimetrodon buried deep beneath their feet, by the fossilized footprints of sauropods pressed into rock that had once been Jurassic mud. None of them could have known any of that history. None of them could have known what they themselves were about to become, a species that would, within a stretch of time so short it barely registers on the geological scale this entire story has been told in, learn to farm, to write, to build cities, to leave the planet's atmosphere completely, and, eventually, to dig up the bones of everything that came before and try, however imperfectly, to piece the whole staggering story back together. Everything in the 11 chapters before this one, nearly 4 billion years of chemistry, catastrophe, extinction, and reinvention, had to happen in exactly the sequence it happened, for this particular species to exist at all. Change one extinction event. Remove one lucky survivor. Shift one asteroid's trajectory by a matter of degrees, 66 million years ago, and there is no guarantee anything resembling us would be here to tell this story at all. That's not a comforting thought, exactly. But it might be worth sitting with anyway, the next time you're outside on a clear night, looking up at a moon that was born from a planetary collision 4.5 billion years ago, standing on a world that spent most of its history with absolutely no one around to notice it at all. If this journey through 4 billion years of life before us was worth your time, consider subscribing to the Sleepy Archive, the past, told slowly, one silence at a time.